Hey everybody, my name is Will Samuel, and today I'll be discussing my master's thesis research entitled When Beavers Get Burned, Do Fish Get Fried? Wildfires are increasing in size, frequency, and severity throughout the boreal biome. You can see this in the bottom left of the slide in green. And in the top right of that figure, you can see the distribution of wildfires in orange in Alaska since 1984. Note that the distribution of the boreal biome and the distribution of wildfires in Alaska lines up really well, and that's because wildfires are a dominant and widespread disturbance process throughout the boreal region. You can also see the fire history for the study area I'll be discussing today up in the top right, where different colored polygons represent different historical burns. A study published in 2020 by Emily Fairfax for her PhD work suggests that beavers and wildfires may interact with each other, and in fact, beavers may have the ability to mediate fire effects on streams by damming them. Basically, beaver dams increase the wetted width of a stream, wetting the riparian vegetation, which reduces both the proximity and the severity of burns on stream ecosystems. It's also important to note that both beavers and wildfires affect fish in numerous ways, which vary by region and lack research. So my study kind of comes down to one research question, which is at the convergence of these topics. And that research question is, how do beavers mediate the effects of wildfire on fish and aquatic habitat? You can see that kind of lined out on my conceptual model on the right. Part one of my thesis will be looking at how do fires affect beavers. There's not very many studies on this, but what is out there suggests that wildfires and beavers have a negative feedback relationship. That means that wildfires reduce beaver populations and beaver populations suppress wildfires. The second part of my thesis will be looking at how do beavers affect fish. This is very well studied in some parts of North America, but not in Alaska. There's only one set of robust studies that look at beaver effects on fish. Uh, Different meta-analyses of beaver and fish relationships come to the conclusion that beavers tend to reduce connectivity for fish, which has a negative effect on their populations, but it increases productivity, usually in the form of fish growth. So those results are complex and they're mediated by the habitat type, the flow condition, the fish species, and the life stage of that species. I'll be approaching part one of my thesis with a GIS or remote sensing approach. This is an in-progress study which I started in January, and I'll be sampling throughout all 5 major drainages in my study area, which you can see up here in the top right. Basically what I'm doing is using satellite imagery to locate and enumerate beaver dams throughout these areas. And once I've collected all the beaver dams, I'll be building predictive models that predict different dam parameters using landscape attributes. Once I have those models built, I'll test hypotheses about beaver and fire relationships. Just to kind of show what that looks like, again, you have my study area on the left. I've went ahead and broken that up into subcatchments. These are 6-level basins. They're about 100 square kilometers each. And what I'm doing with the help of 2 technicians this spring is searching through each of these subcatchments individually using satellite imagery and tracing up their streamlines and looking for beaver dams. Once I find a beaver dam, like you can see on the right, we drop a point in ArcGIS. We trace a polygon around its wetted width to capture its area, and then we include some metadata about that dam, such as the type and condition of the dam. Like I mentioned, once I have all those dams collected, I'll use those different dam parameters as a response to the suite of predictors, including wildfire history, things like time since last burn and burn severity. We also have digital elevation models available for the entire study area through the program NetMap, which can calculate all sorts of useful watershed attributes, things like valley width, slope, and stream power, which are good predictors of beaver dams. And then some studies have also shown that vegetation and land cover models are also good predictors of beaver dams, so I'm hoping to incorporate those as well. Once I have those models built, like I mentioned, I'll be testing different hypotheses. Kind of this hypothesis from Fairfax and Whittle, 2020, that beavers have the potential to reduce wildfire effects on streams. And then maybe the more important hypothesis to my study is what are the effects of fires on beavers? And there's about 3 studies that look at that. You can see here on the right, this Hood et al. Study shows a negative relationship between active beaver lodges and cumulative area burned. I do have some preliminary results from this since I've been working on it for about 2 months. This is just my study area broken up into subcatchments again. I've sampled about 75 out of the 205 subcatchments that are within this study area. Through that, we've found about 452 potential beaver dams. You can see those here in black dots. And when we find a beaver dam, we either classify it as a yes, we're sure it has to have some clear distinct feature that shows it's obviously a beaver dam, or a maybe. So out of those 452 potential beaver dams, we're sure about 198, and those are distributed throughout 58 basins. Some basic summary statistics. There's about 5.8 of the yes ponds per basin, or about 6.4 per 100 square kilometers. And the mean pond area is just under 2,000 square meters, or about 2,300 square meters per 100 kilometers. There's fires in 73 out of 75 of these basins, and even though some of those fires are really small and maybe insignificant, and 65% of those yes dams, those dams we're sure about, do occur within a burned polygon, and you can kind of see that distribution over here on the right. I do have some basic statistical tests from this, some preliminary results. So far, I've found that there's a greater number of burned ponds than unburned ponds in the study area I've sampled, we kind of already knew that from the summary statistics, but that is statistically significant. And there's also burned ponds also have a statistically significantly smaller area than unburned ponds, so that's notable as well. Although I would like to mention that sampling's not complete, it's not spatially balanced yet. I hope to do a census sample of this entire study area minus some of the developed spots and wetland complexes that we can't sample reliably. So we should make sure to take these results with a grain of salt. So we're at a fisheries conference, and I'm sure you're all wondering by now, how does all of this relate to fish? Well, that's what I hope to find out this summer. I'll be conducting a field study throughout the same study area. Ideally, I'll be able to sample throughout all 5 of these major drainages, but it'll really depend on access and logistics. And basically, I'll sample Arctic grayling within the field, within, around, and away from beaver ponds. And I'll kind of explain that in the next slide. I'll sample fish via angling and electrofishing. I'll pit tag fish to track growth, things like weight, length, and body condition using bioelectrical impedance analysis. I'll calculate a relative abundance among sites using catch per unit effort and a mark recapture estimator. We have the ability to assess sex and maturity status using non-lethal endoscopy. I'll also measure some basic beaver dam parameters, things like dam height that might restrict upstream dispersal. And then I'd also like to conduct some opportunistic minnow trapping for other species that may overlap in these beaver-affected habitats, such as especially important species such as juvenile Chinook salmon. Just to quickly cover my experimental design, over here on the left, you can see what I'll define as one site. One site has multiple stream reaches in it. So we'll have a treatment reach, which you can see here in green, kind of in the middle. And that's going to be actually the non-flowing area of the beaver pond. Just kind of a side note, I did actually catch Arctic grayling in this pond last summer doing some pilot research. So I know that grayling can both access some beaver ponds and that we can sample them within. I'll also have a reference reach above and below beaver ponds. Those are pretty typical in studies looking at beaver effects on streams. And then I'll have a control reach somewhere further down in the watershed, ideally in an area with unrestricted fish passage. I hope to repeat that sample design for about 15 sites throughout my study area and resample each 3 times throughout the summer, enough to determine a growth trend. As far as the implications for this work, beaver reintroductions are being conducted widely throughout North America and the world to try to bring beaver populations back from heavy historical trapping. And a lot of those reintroductions are in areas with dominant wildfire regimes and also important fish. So it's important to consider how they may affect the overall ecology. As far as potential effects on fish production, beavers tend to reduce the connectivity of streams by damming them so that fish can't access the entire stream network, but that may be offset by growth. So it's important to consider how fish production might be affected by beaver dams, and especially how that might vary by region. To my knowledge, this is also the first study to bring these concepts together. Like I mentioned, there's a few studies looking at wildfire and beaver relationships. There's a lot of studies looking at beaver and fish relationships, just not in Alaska. But to my knowledge, this is the first study that considers all 3 of these in one cohesive set of studies. So that's both exciting and intimidating. There's also value in conducting this research in a relatively pristine area like Alaska that hasn't experienced a lot of the historical beaver trapping and wildfire suppression that a lot of the rest of North America has. And there's also, of course, implications towards climate resilience and adaptation, both for wildfire management and fisheries and wildlife management if wildfires continue to increase in the boreal region. With that, I'd like to thank everyone who's contributed to this work, and especially my committee and co-authors on this presentation. They've lended their expertise many times. I'd like to thank everyone at the Freshwater Fish Ecology Lab at UAF. They've helped with both brainstorming and technical advice. I'd like to give a big thank you to my technicians, Rachel Allen and Evan Brashear. They've been doing the bulk of the data collection for the remote sensing GIS study. And I'd like to thank funding, which is from the Strategic Environmental Research and Development Program, which is the Department of Defense. And I've also received a student seed grant from the Alaska EPSCoR Fire and Ice Program to help supplement this work. With that, I'd be happy to take any questions, thoughts, or ideas.